Brazilian President Lula opens the G20 summit in Rio, focusing on global hunger and poverty. U.S. President Joe Biden announces $4 billion pledge to World Bank's Development Fund. An Israeli spokesperson confirms its military operation in Lebanon will continue amid ceasefire talks. It's 10 minutes to 8 p.m. local time, and you're now watching Q News. We begin today's bulletin with the latest development in Rio de Janeiro and the G20 summit. Egypt's President Fattah and Brazilian President Lula have reaffirmed their support for a two-state solution. The two leaders met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, where they discussed regional issues including Palestine. President Sisi expressed gratitude for Brazil's invitation, emphasizing Egypt's role in the Middle East and Africa. Both leaders commended the summit's organization and Brazil's focus on developing countries, particularly the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. The meeting concluded upgrading bilateral relations to a strategic partnership. Egypt and Brazil have signed a strategic partnership to mark 100 years of diplomatic relations. The agreement aims to boost bilateral cooperation in areas such as peace, sustainable development, multilateral reform, and global trade, with the focus on addressing hunger, poverty, and inequality. As BRICS members, both countries are committed to strengthening regional integration and cooperation among global South nations. The partnership includes enhancing diplomatic dialogue, coordinating on mutual interests, and promoting multilateralism. An action plan will be developed and updated to guide their evolving relationship. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva opened the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, emphasizing global hunger and poverty as urgent priorities. Citing 733 million people as suffering from malnutrition, Lula launched a global alliance against hunger and poverty, urging G20 nations to leverage their economic power to address these crises. The summit occurs amid escalating global conflicts, with Lula lamenting the highest number of armed conflicts since World War II. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced a $4 billion pledge to the World Bank's International Development Association fund aimed at supporting the world's poorest countries. This announcement came during his final address to the Group of 20 summit in Europe. The amount is a record and exceeds the $3.5 billion Washington committed in the previous International Development Association replenishment round in December 2021. Furthermore, U.S. President Joe Biden has called on G20 nations to intensify efforts to address global challenges, including the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan. Speaking at the summit, Biden highlighted U.S. initiatives to combat hunger and poverty, noting that $160 billion investment in global development during his term. He reaffirmed U.S. support for Ukraine's sovereignty and condemned the ongoing violence in Gaza, while backing Israel's right to self-defense. Biden stressed on the importance of ensuring its actions are conducted responsibly. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has urged Chinese President Xi Jinping to build consistent and durable ties between their nations during a meeting at the G20 summit in Brazil. This marked the first meeting between the two leaders since 2018. Starmer expressed optimism, highlighting potential cooperation in trade, the economy, climate, science, technology, health and education. The Prime Minister also suggested a meeting between UK Finance Minister Rachel Reeves and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng ahead of the planned resumption of the UK-China economic and financial dialogue early next year. And for us on the summit, we now move to Rahem in our newsroom. Rahem, over to you.
Thank you, Henny. For further analysis of the G20 summit today, we're joined from New Delhi by the political science professor, Upamanyu Basu. Welcome to Q News and thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you
Firstly,
so much.
let's start off by asking a broader question. In what ways can the G20 foster better international cooperation to tackle cross-border challenges such as political conflicts, given the geopolitical circumstances right now within the globe, basically?
Right. Thank you first of all, for having me. This question is very pertinent, especially the times that we are seeing right now. We have a crisis in Middle East. We have a crisis ongoing in the Eurasia. At this juncture, the legacy that the Indian presidency of G20 has left behind is that if designed properly, G20 communiques can evolve from just summits where just talks happen and fancy dinners happen, but some core agendas can also evolve. So New Delhi's presidency had shown us that before some failed attempts of G20 as well. G20 in general does not even have an office, right? So it is not an institution of sorts with buildings, but the nature of the forum is that right now it is one of the highest representative bodies to ever exist, with more than 80% of GDP, world's GDP represented, more than two-thirds of the world population represented. So in that order, there is no other forum that represents the entire world in an equitable fashion. That's why you also see in G20, the success of G20 forum, or what we call as summit diplomacy, is that the rise of the rest thesis that is pretty evident in international relations, which is the rise of the global south. The voice is being heard by the repeated troika that has been established right now, which is India, Brazil, and South Africa. These are the voice of the countries which have not been represented in the West dominated international forums. I'm talking about maybe G7, which is a group of the wealthy countries. So, a forum which is represented by, equitably represented by all the other countries, that is the beauty of G20. That is the strength of G20 in that way. So, there is no other forum, there is no other alternative right now.
Okay, well, since you talked about the idea of representation for both spectrums of the world, how can the G20 address the growing food insecurity caused by conflicts? And obviously this affects many of the nations in the global south.
Right. So, as President De Silva has already pointed out in his opening speech, is that hunger is not just an issue. Hunger is to be looked at as a human rights, and hunger and food security is linked. Food security is linked with supply chains. Supply chains then is linked with global conflict. So a war in Ukraine does not is not directly linked to what is happening in New Delhi, for example, where I am, but it affects the global food chain and it affects a crisis in Middle East maybe. So in that way, a forum that represents the voices of the marginalized countries, a G20 does that job for you, which other organizations won't. There is a criticism of
Yes.
G20 maybe also that it does not have teats. It does not have maybe law enforcement agencies. That can be a criticism maybe, but we can talk about that. Yeah.
But mainly, as you've said, that the G20 is focused on the idea of a global economy. But there are also other topics up for discussion. What are the most critical issues that have dominated this year's G20 summit discussions?
Right. So to contextualize the major issues of this presidency, the earlier presidency, because the beauty of G20 is also that it happens it has a troika fashion that happens. So continuity is a major agenda here. So in the past couple of G20 summits, you have already noticed maybe that the major themes have always been sustainability, green climate, financing, equitable distribution, debt vulnerabilities of countries. So these were already pointed out in the New Delhi Declaration as well. And a similar agenda has also been seen in the Brazilian presidency, where the major issues have been debt financing, hunger, poverty alleviation, and a very interesting one is taxation of the rich, which is one of the most controversial agendas in this presidency.
Well, sir, you touched on the idea of sustainability and, climate issues in general. So what concrete steps should the G20 take to ensure some sort of meaningful progress when it comes to global climate change commitments, especially, in heels of food insecurity? Obviously, climate change affects this.
See, right now, the major agendas that are coming out is that the first meeting that will happen is on debt financing, which is one of the most important ones for marginalized countries. The next day, which is November 19th, some plenary sessions have been planned where discussions will happen on the basis of food and poverty alleviation programs. The commitment that New Delhi and Brazil always had was also that a level of global commitment is required if you need to solve the problem of world hunger. And this is also linked to our SDG goals also, which is linked to our 2030 goals, that this is something that cannot be solved by one country alone. So that's why a global consensus needs to come out. And what is linked with food insecurity is also the issue of climate change. One of the criticisms of G20 has always been that there has been more talks about climate change. But coming from New Delhi, we are literally choking here with AQIs rising more than 500. So this is also has been, and one of the most important contentions is also the return of Trump. So when Trump has returned to the Oval Office, these agendas, will it hamper the kind of policies that Trump will come up with, is also something that needs to be taken care of in the future.
Okay, that was political science professor Upamanu Basu. Thank you so much for joining us from
Conference. COP29 President Mukhtar Babayev emphasized the importance of the G20, stating that its leadership is crucial for advancing climate finance progress.
The G20 will be meeting later today in Brazil. They account for 85% of global GDP and 80% of emissions. Their leadership is essential to making progress on all pillars of the Paris Agreement, from finance to mitigation and adaptation. We cannot succeed without them, and the world is waiting to hear from them. We urge them to use a G20 meeting to send a positive signal of their commitment to addressing the climate crisis. We want them to provide clear mandates to deliver at COP29. This is their chance to show their leadership.
And from Rio, we now move to the latest developments in Lebanon.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين. وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
United States diplomat Amos Hochstein has delayed his planned trip to Beirut. Ceasefire talks between Hezbollah and Israel were originally set for Monday. Despite reports of Hezbollah's openness to talks, the United States seeks further clarifications before Hochstein resumes efforts to mediate peace in the region.
So that's what I mean when I say we're going to have to work on a...
Lebanese Health Ministry has issued a statement announcing that the Israeli enemy's raid on Beirut's Ras Naba area resulted in the death of 7 people and the injury of 16. The statement also said that the final toll of the Israeli enemy raid on Beirut's Mar Elias resulted in the death of 3 persons, including a woman, and the injury of 29 others. Lebanon's health ministry has reported that the death toll of the ongoing Israeli war on Lebanon has reached 3,516, with over 14,900 wounded. According to the report, airstrikes carried out by Israel Sunday, November 17th, alone have killed 35 people and injured 143 others. An Israeli government spokesperson has confirmed that the military operation in Lebanon will continue as negotiations progress over a U.S. proposal to secure a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Spokesperson David Mensa stated that Israel will only agree to halt fighting once the threat at its northern border is eliminated.
But we'll be very straight with you. The military campaign will continue.
The United States has introduced a draft proposal aimed at de-escalating the conflict in Lebanon, focusing on a ceasefire, Hezbollah's disarmament, and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Russian President Vladimir Putin has met with the Russian-installed governor of Ukraine's Zaporizhia region, Yevgeny Balitsky, in the Kremlin. The meeting, planned as a part of the Russian president's working schedule, took place amid reports from the United States that President Joe Biden had approved Ukraine to use long-range missiles to target Russia. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has stated that any U.S. decision to allow Ukraine to fire U.S.-supplied long-range missiles deep into Russia would mean direct involvement by Washington in the conflict, which he accused President Joe Biden's administration of escalating. He also said that President Vladimir Putin made Russia's position absolutely clear on how Russia would interpret such a decision, and that it would raise the risk of a confrontation with the US-led NATO alliance. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico has voiced strong opposition to the US decision allowing Ukraine to use long-range weapons in strikes against Russia. He criticized the move as an unprecedented escalation, claiming it undermines efforts to begin peace negotiations and prolongs the conflict in Ukraine, leading to further loss of life. British Defence Minister John Healey has announced in the House of Commons that ammunition and artillery packages will be sent to Ukraine as part of the UK's increased military support. Healey stated that Britain is spending more on military aid to Ukraine than ever before, emphasizing the need to double down on support, marking nearly 1,000 days since Russia's conflict with Ukraine.
Today, that we must double down on the support for Ukraine.
In the economic news, global markets had a mixed performance amid key economic data released from Asia. In the United States, early trading, the S&P 500 was up less than 0.1%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average traded 0.1% lower. In Europe, Germany's DAX lost 0.2%, while the CAC 40 edged 0.1% lower, and Britain's FTSE 100 gained 0.2%. In Asia, Japan's Nikkei 225 index dropped 1.1%, South Korea's Kospi jumped 2.2%, the Hang Seng in Hong Kong added 0.8%, while the Shanghai Composite Index traded 0.2% lower. Oil prices edged up as concerns about fuel demand in China and forecasts of a global oil surplus weighed on markets. Brent crude futures were up 0.7% to $71.51 a barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude futures were up 0.5% at $67.35 a barrel. Gold prices rebounded after posting losses in the previous 6 sessions, while investors await comments from the Federal Reserve officials for clarity on the interest rate trajectory. Spot gold rose 1.3% to $2,593.32 per ounce. U.S. gold futures were up 1.1% at $2,597.80. And in the world of sports, Rafa Nadal says that he is focused solely on helping Spain win the Davis Cup finals in Malaga this week, rather than reflecting on his impending retirement. The 22-time Grand Slam champion, set to end his illustrious career at the team competition, has hinted he may play only doubles if it improves Spain's chances of securing a 7th title.
If I am on court, hopefully not, no, because at the end I am not.
Thousands of runners gathered in Havana for the annual Marabana Marathon, which took participants through routes lined with the Cuban capital's iconic landmarks. Around 2,300 athletes from 46 countries competed in the 10, 21 and 42-kilometer races during the 38th edition of the Caribbean islands' premier marathon event. These are all the news we have for now, but here's a reminder of today's main stories. Brazilian President Lula opens the G20 summit in Rio, focusing on global hunger and poverty. US President Joe Biden announces $4 billion pledge to the World Bank's Development Fund. An Israeli spokesperson confirms military operation in Lebanon will continue amid ceasefire talks. This concludes our news bulletin for this hour, but please don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at Qnews EGY to stay informed. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.